everyone, Ben here, introducing the last episode of the first season of the Infinite Library podcast. In today's episode, John and I discuss Vladimir Sorokin's novel Telluria, published by NYRB Books and translated by Max Lawton. It's a stunning, multi-genre, multi-style, polyphonic novel consisting of 50 short chapters where the style changes every chapter, and it takes place in this sort of future post global hegemony world where there's all these sort of individual city-states, and the book kind of takes us through each one. John and I had a lot of fun talking about sort of the way satire works and nationalism and sort of the benefits and also some of the potential drawbacks of reading in translation, where you take an author like Sorokin, who writes in this very particular Russian context, and translate him into English, and sort of what are the benefits of doing that, and then do you lose anything? So that's some of the stuff we cover on this episode. We had a great time talking about it. I'm glad John agreed to read some Sorokin with me. I'm always trying to read Sorokin. I find him very fascinating. On another note, I just wanted to say thanks to anyone who listened, reached out, commented, or I don't know, just tweeted at us on the internet. It's great hearing from people who listen to what we do and like it. And John and I have been thinking about doing this for a while, and we're glad to see that people have been enjoying it. And it's we're looking forward to doing it in the future. So you won't be hearing from us from a little bit, although we do have an episode next week as sort of an interim episode between our first and second season with Phil Ford from Weird Studies. So stay tuned for that. And then stay tuned for announcements about our season 2. You can follow us on X at Infinite Library Pod, or YouTube at Infinite Library Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Infinite Library. I'm your host, John.
I'm your host, Ben.
And we are back to the classic John and Ben duo configuration. We do not have any friends of the show or guests. We are all by our lonesomes. We are tastefully nude, oiled up, ready to go,
reclined on respective divans. Yes.
We're getting comfy again now. We don't have to impress any Batman podcasters or professional academics,
published authors. You know, it's just the two of us, and it's the end of season 1. We did it. We did season 1. We're bringing it back home, just the two of us. Classic Infinite Library episode.
Wonderful. Ben, what are we talking about tonight?
So we're talking about Telluria by Vladimir Sorokin, published originally in 2013 and was translated into English by Max Lawton for the New York Review of Books in 2022.
Now, Ben, this was a you pick to close out the season. Do you want to tell the nice folks at home kind of a little bit about why you were interested in picking up this book? I feel like Sorokin's an author who's been getting a lot of buzz lately, largely because of the phenomenal work Max Lawton has been doing with Dalkey Archive and New York Review of Books. But what got you interested in this text in particular? I know you've read a little Sorokin before.
Yeah, so as you sort of alluded to, John, I feel like he's been getting a lot of press, especially in the sort of smaller press circuit, as well as the broader news cycle, which we can get into later. But one of the reasons that I'm interested in this book and in Sorokin is it seems like he just doesn't really play by the rules. Like he will, he doesn't play by the rules. Like in this book, for instance, there are 50 chapters, 50 discrete satirical styles, various genre exercises, and no real overarching plot. In Blue Lard, there are clones of famous Russian authors who reproduce weird versions of the text you might expect based on the clone names. One book I just read by him, The Queue, is nothing but dialogue from people waiting in line for a Soviet sort of handout, and like nobody knows what the handout is. They just know that they want to be in line. So the entire book is just attributed dialogue. And, you know, I'm sure, listener, you've heard me bang on about how much I hate, you know, realist novels. This guy seemed like doing the complete opposite, and I thought, you know what, I'd like to check him out. And so I read Blue Lard and The Queue, and I wanted to read Telluria, and I said, John, let's check it out.
And I said yes.
Yeah, and I'm glad, because we got to read it, and again, he's somebody who I think, like, I like that he doesn't play by any rules, and I think that's partly the draw for people who want to read him in translation, and the fact that, you know, he gets translated at all, because, like, imagine, like, I don't know. I'm sure there are American authors that take this amount of risk, but I feel like the amount of publishers who are going to take a chance on them is less than if they're in translation.
No, I definitely agree with that. This definitely feels, you know, I feel like at least in kind of the American litosphere, like people who read translated books already tend to be a little bit more on the adventurous side. I don't really know if the opposite is true in terms of what kind of novels make it over to other countries. And I'm sure it varies a lot from country to country as well. But kind of learning a little bit about Sorokin as we were reading through this book and preparing for this week's episode, I was just really struck by what an interesting figure he is. He's been working really since, I think, the mid 70s. So even kind of pre-fall of the Soviet Union into kind of the modern Russian state, Russian Federation state, and just kind of maintaining this very powerful presence in Russian letters, like often to his own detriment in terms of getting in trouble with the government and various piss babies who make up the kind of thugocracy of modern Russia. But still, like, kind of an ambivalent figure. I definitely found myself challenged reading this book by a lot of the things he has to say about particularly like Soviet nostalgia, Soviet apologism, kind of really the what this book, I think, says about the potential of like revolutionary or even like reformist politics to make anything better in the world. I think he's a guy who has a very odd idiosyncratic viewpoint, and really was a pleasure to get to experience this. And I definitely want to read some of his other stuff going forward.
Yeah, and I did a little research into him because I feel like while I was enjoying it, I feel like, as you were kind of alluding to, John, there's a lot of like very particular Soviet context that he's responding to, and sometimes it can be useful to brush up. And one book that I found that was particularly useful was actually published not too long ago, Vladimir Sorokin's Discourses in 2020 by an academic named Dick Uffelman. It was an interesting name. But Uffelman kind of puts Sorokin in this group of artists in Moscow that were known as the Moscow conceptualists. And the interesting thing about the conceptualists is they were kind of notorious for neither affirming state propaganda and Soviet realism nor completely rejecting it. And in fact, they were more about presenting art that made you think about the conditions of similar things or the art being given to you exactly. And so like Dick Uffelman says essentially that in conceptualism, not the object is relevant, but the relationship to the object. Conceptualism is a distance relationship both toward the work of art and to culture in general. And I think that kind of leads to Sorokin's ambivalence, his kind of ambiguity, Although he is more than willing to step into the role as the dissident author, which America is, quite eager to find examples of, given, Russia's war with Ukraine. And while Sorokin has sort of performed that role, I don't think you can reduce him just to the dissident author. And I think he's a little more like confusing and complicated. And I think his sort of weird style kind of allows him to do that, which is why I think he's so interesting.
Yeah, I definitely didn't get the vibe reading him. He doesn't feel like there are definitely artists who you run into when you kind of get interested in art. Again, the kind of standard dissident artist mold. Like I think of like Ai Weiwei as a pretty standard example of that, where it's like it's not even necessarily that the work is bad. It's just that like it is not worth the like level of celebrity this person is garnering, largely through like CIA connections and things like that. Sorokin, at the very least, feels like a much more authentic voice, and the work is actually very, very interesting. I something I do find interesting, kind of with what you're saying with the conceptualists there, and something that I think actually does come through a little bit in this book, is again kind of the odd way that I think the collapse of the Soviet Union was experienced.
Yeah.
For a lot of people living in it. I listened a couple months ago to the Radio War Nerd series on the fall of the Soviet Union, which is a really, really great series. One of the hosts of that show, Mark Ames, pretty popular journalist, but just in case people in our audience aren't familiar with him, he actually lived in Russia during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at the time, a lot of people, probably people kind of in similar milieus to Sorokin, kind of young, artistic people living in the city, there was an understanding that the Soviet Union was imperfect, but it wasn't on the verge of collapse until it did. Yeah. There was this idea that there was going to be more reform, and that maybe they were going to drop most of the formal pretenses of socialism for kind of a leveraged buyout by the Western powers, America in particular. But the critique that they were doing, I feel like probably originally started from a place of a lot more, maybe not affection, but definitely more of a reformist impulse. Whereas Telluria feels like a book that is a lot more skeptical of not just the Soviet project, but kind of any project. Yeah, I think this is a book, and we're going to get into this. Don't worry, but this is a book that I really think is grappling with kind of the whole like nexus of human desire, and like the desire to change the world at all, and whether or not that can ever be like a simple good thing.
Yeah, and that's why I like that conceptual angle, because like in Telluria, you're presented with like, it could be this. You want this desire? Do you want this one? And they're sort of all like kind of presented. And while we're going to get into it, you can detect Sorokin has kind of a bias. I think in some ways, sort of that relationship with the text is kind of radical, because it can be like, do you like any of these options? It's sort of like the feeling you get from reading it. Like, even though you know that they're bad, like, would you pick this one? Would you stay like, so conceptually, we could mention that like in Telluria, it's so far a future post what is apparently an like Islamic holy war against Europe that was quite disastrous, but it's over now, and Europe is sort of splintered into a bunch of like city states. And so like you kind of visit each city state, and in some ways Sorokin is kind of going like, what about this one? Would you like this one? Even though like they're all kind of like presented kind of skeptically, like there's not one that's like the one, although we will say that he is kind of biased towards a couple. So
yeah, I mean, Ben, I don't know about you. I would be a proud citizen of the ultra-Stalinist Soviet Socialist Republic.
Yeah, you would get the visit with Stalin every evening on the house.
I'd be a good Russian Orthodox communist praying to the state and God.
Yeah, of Stalin. My sins. Yeah, you can have some nice Georgian dishes and see the chorus line. Yeah. So.
But I think what's interesting in this book, I found myself as I was reading this, thinking to kind of a lot of works of kind of English language, I guess for lack of a better term, kind of dystopian or utopian science fiction, these books that are all about kind of presenting you with a different version of society. And I think that what is really interesting with Sorokin is, I'll just pick an example out of a hat, but I saw the trailer for the new film adaptation of the novel Uglies by Scott Westerfield, which is a book that I read when I was like 12 and I'm kind of shocked that there's going to be an adaptation of it. It's a fine YA novel, but basically it's a dystopian novel, and kind of over the course of 3 books, we see this dystopian society, and then in the great tradition of YA dystopia, it's overthrown by the end and everyone's happy.
Thank God, John. Thank God that the overthrow happens at the end. I don't know what would happen if it didn't happen. So,
but I think in rejecting plot as a kind of a lattice work to build this text on, I think Sorokin does do something pretty radical. I think that what he does here that's so interesting and so cool, like just on a purely like technical standpoint, this book is like, I kind of hate this term, but it's very in vogue in kind of science fiction and fantasy writing circles. This is like amazing world building.
Yeah.
Like the fact that you spend your time in kind of like 50 different people's heads in like 50 discrete little corners of this world. Like I have a way better idea of like what this world looks like than I do, say, what the world looks like in text we read for this book, for this podcast, The Dragon Waiting. Which is very focused in on like a handful of characters and their experience of the world. And this isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just the reality of what plot necessitates. It's something that, as I've kind of been working through in my own writing right now, is kind of like, what does plot necessitate, and what do you kind of lose in giving this, your writing over to plot, and the ways that restricts you. And Sorokin really rejects that outright here. And this, really from the jump, you're just I found the first chapter to be so fascinating because there is no real attempt to ground you in this world. Like,
you're just
right from the go. It's like, okay, so we have giants. We have
2
dwarves.
huge giants, 2 small dwarves.
They're plotting the downfall of a republic that does not exist in our world, but which is kind of one of these successor states to the collapsed Russian Federation. They're having 800 sets of brass knuckles forged to spark off a revolution. And then we go to chapter 2, and that's never mentioned again.
Well, they do allude to like an opposing political party that's fighting these people, but all you get is the opposing political party's perspective, and you don't return to the one that it started with. And they're like, damn, they're building all these brass knuckles. Like, what are we going to do about it? And then that's it, basically. Yeah.
Or chapter 2, which is obviously the very next chapter, is kind of this little travel letter from kind of a straight like English, maybe like spy or like some kind of like weird traveler who's clearly like in this area for somewhat nefarious purposes, including like sex tourism.
Yeah, and you get some really interesting depictions of Moscow as being like the head of a sleeping giant, like the whatever the state is that's coalesced around Moscow is like this weird gray fog sleeping giant headscape. And he's like, oh, and I was enjoying some of the sex tourism, and you get depictions of that. Yeah.
And then I remember I was mentioning because I annotate my books for the show sometimes, depending on how much time I have. And this is one that I at least started off doing that. And I was like, asking questions about like who this speaker was. Like, is this person trustworthy? Like, can we trust what they're saying? Are they being like intentionally absurd in like the way that they're like talking about some of this stuff? But at the very end, like mentioning like, he's British, can't trust him. And I was like, I can't wait to like get back to this guy and like see what he's up to, because I didn't realize what the conceit of the text was yet. And then we immediately go into this. The chapter 3 is just like an unbroken, like 3-page long paragraph that is just a prayer to communist Orthodox Christianity.
Right, against the struggling with communism, Russian Orthodox fundamentalism, fascism, atheism, globalism, agnosticism, neo-feudalism, devilish confoundments, virtual witchcraft, verbal terrorism, computerized drug addiction, liberal spinelessness, aristocratic national patriotism, geopolitics, and it just keeps going on. Yeah.
So yeah, this text it's very interesting because it really reads almost more like an anthology of short stories than it does like a novel, despite the way that it's kind of ostensibly sold to you as a novel. But there are, again, I think that what's interesting is that he is building this world around you, and kind of throughout this, you do get these little hints of the way that things you see in one story tie into things you'll see in another. And there are also through lines that carry through the whole book. Yeah. Probably the biggest one, and I think we need to talk about this before we go any further, right? Which is the titular, well, not titular, what Telluria refers to is this metal tellurium.
Yeah, the singular tellurium nail.
Yes. So tellurium is, I think, the kind of central metaphor of the text, and it's a pretty blunt one, somewhat ironically considering how it's used in the book. But tellurium is this strange metal that is discovered at some point in like this ancient Zoroastrian temple, and it has apparently been used in like religious rites by kind of this lost Zoroastrian sect that has been kind of lost to the sands of time. But eventually people realize that if you take a nail made of tellurium, or like a wedge of tellurium, and you hammer it into a certain point in your skull directly into your brain, it does a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's like it's some sort of like religious, more than a drug trip, something. Yeah.
So there's like a trip element. It like kind of lets you like travel through time or speak to the dead.
Like you can meet Stalin in the
Stalin or Plato or your dead brother who stole like a shovel from you that you need to find.
Yeah, you need the shovel so you can pay off the money that the shovel costs. Yeah.
It also like maybe gives you super strength, and or lets you like channel, like see into the future. There's definitely like a couple bits where like people kind of see into the future, or see like solutions to problems by using tellurium. But I think what Sorokin is doing here is he's really grappling with, I think tellurium is kind of supposed to represent, for lack of a better term, like any kind of like ideological thinking, whether that's political ideology, like socialism, or some kind of religious ideology.
Like like we meet some Knight Templars that are having all of their skulls be banged in with nails to go on a crusade to protect Christendom. So ideology.
I mean, I don't want to be too like blasé about it. I don't think that I don't want to like downplay what I think that's doing. I think that I'll be frank. I'm going to go out on a limb here and go on record on the show. I think allegory can get a little bit of a bad rap. I know that we all obviously C.S. Lewis, hack, whatever. We all like Tolkien better. Yeah, I mean that's because he was a better writer.
Deal with it.
Deal with it. I mean, is anyone arguing that C.S. Lewis is a better writer than Tolkien?
I mean,
I've never met that person.
I've heard that before from some people, and I was like, I don't even
dislike C.S. Lewis. I'll go out on a limb here on the show, and I'll say I think Till We Have Faces is a fine novel.
Yeah.
If we're talking about his books for adults. I've never read a single one of the Narnia books, and I feel like it's too late. But anyway. I think that sometimes like there's nothing wrong with having like a metaphor that is maybe a little on the head if you are able to use it in a way that's pretty effective.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I actually wanted secondary lit is I was talking to friend of the pod, Aiko, about this book, and I mentioned the title, and she was like, well, is that a reference to a strand of Russian nationalism, which is largely responsible from Alexander Dugin, who some people think is one of the prophets of Russia's attempt to reclaim Ukraine. And the idea with that is that a tellerocracy or land power is going to defeat the sea power of the United States. And Dugin was a Eurasianist who basically that's the belief that Russia is the center of the world, that Russia determines where everything goes, and importantly for Sorokin's purposes, all of Russia is one unified monolith, which I think, as you were kind of hinting at, John, this book is definitely not about that. And the fact that these 50 chapters are all presented without one unifying thing except the Telluria nail, which could mean different things to different people. And so, like, some people don't want to, like, they're like, oh, Sorokin is only like kind of playing with Dugin, like but I think it's an interesting reference that he's sort of saying, like, oh, this is what we would look like if there was one unifying thing. Actually, it would just be tellurium nails and everything would be different. So I think, like, ideology is still a point to be made for what the nails are doing. But I also think in the book, he sort of presents the nail in such a, like, different sense that for some people it is ideology. For other people, it's like there's that, like, that child soldier who gets a nail beaten into his head and then just, like, remembers, like, a cat basically that he, like, saw on the battlefield. So there's, like, I don't know, there's the nails they represent truth or ideology or, like, desire to all of these different people, and there's no unifying political project that says they're, like, all equal.
Yeah, well, I think that I said ideology at first, and I actually think that was a bit of a misnomer on my part, so I apologize to the listeners. I think that, like you said, but I think it's a little broader than that. I think that, like, the exact thing it is a little hard to find, like, a word for. I think probably desire is the closest thing, but that desire, like you said, it manifests so differently in different people depending on kind of the context they find themselves in. And I think that chapter focusing on the child soldier who's obsessed with finding this cat is actually, like, pretty illustrative of that, because he is someone who clearly, like, getting the nail shoved in his head, like, was this quasi religious experience. Like, it made his life make sense in a way that it did not before. And, like, he has a purpose now, but that purpose is ultimately, like, futile and probably, like, I feel like there's definitely, like, an implication, like, he's not well, like, he's not going to, like, ever find this cat. Like, he's probably going to die, like, doing something stupid to, like, try to find this cat. And I think that Sorokin I think he's really coming at it from the angle that, this is going to sound like a little pat, but, bear with me. Like, belief is dangerous. Like, desiring things, like dreaming, maybe dreaming is the best way to conceptualize, like, what tellurium represents. It's like the dream of like a world that you can see, and you decide that you want to make the real world reflect that, whether that's by your ideology, your religion, your just kind of single-minded devotion to, like, a person or a thing. Like, that is dangerous. That, like, leads to all kinds of horrifying consequences, war and, conflict and revolution and counter-revolution. And I think that Sorokin, like, at his heart, I mean, we can get into this a little bit later, or maybe we talk a little bit about, like, the religious elements in this book and kind of where we think maybe his personal beliefs play into that. But I think Sorokin definitely believes that there's kind of a fundamental, like, perversity to, like, the human subject, and like, kind of any attempt for us to manifest our desires or, like, our dreams into the world is always going to be tainted in some way by this, like, perversity.
Yeah, and I agree, but also, like, I had mentioned the conceptualism, and sometimes I, like, wonder if he's just kind of like, you know, do you like this? When there's a character when that father is reunited with his family and he's been told that he had like the tellurium nail beaten into his head multiple times. And he's like, now I was one of the apostles. I was with Jesus when this happened and we're going to do this again. Like that man clearly had a religious experience that was influenced by this tellurium, and you basically get his belief system, but then it just sort of stops short before going like, yeah, this is good or this is bad. It kind of like it's like you're presented with what like a truth looks like from some person, and you go like, do you agree with this? And so like I find like reading it is like kind of uncomfortable. And yeah, there are ones that he clearly has favoritism towards, because, you know, who doesn't? But like there's that one, do you remember that one where there's like a political meeting and like there's a crowd outside that's really mad, and that woman describes how during the war she had to like sacrifice a bunch of stuff for her kids, and then she's in charge now, and she shows that tattoo and it's like a heart and like the heart's beating, and like that, for that woman, she did the right thing. Now, there's kind of an implication that she fucked a bunch of people over, but she thought she was doing the right thing. And so I think that's the interesting part to me, is like these people believe they're doing the right thing, and like, yeah, maybe Sorokin's like, you know, that's probably bad, but like he kind of gives you it, and then like you're kind of left to decide how you're supposed to take it, I get, which is why I find it so interesting.
Well, I actually, I think I agree with you. I think that's why I was using the word like perverse instead of evil.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think that there's this element where, again, I don't think Sorokin is necessarily judging his characters all the time, or like he thinks that they're like doing evil exactly. I mean, I think that there's this element where any attempt to kind of bridge the world of ideals into like the human world is always going to fall short in some way, and in that falling short there's always going to be this gap, and this gap is where bad things can happen. Or things can go like astray, or like lose their initial purpose. And I think that, you know, there are times in the book where I think there are characters who want less from the world. And I think Sorokin, I do definitely think that there are. So, for instance, there's a section towards the end of the book where we follow the story of this young girl who basically kind of by happenstance ends up getting one of these various pieces of sci-fi technology. A smarty pants, which is some kind of like iPhone with like a fully like semi-sentient AI that can like kind of take any shape you want it to. But it's primarily used for like accessing kind of whatever's left of the internet and kind of communicating with people. And she kind of is able to get her hands on one of these things. They're generally very expensive. You know, someone in kind of this peasant milieu should not have one. And it really like improves the life of her family like a lot. Like it's able to like give her parents and like grandfather like advice on what they should do to like save time or money or use their resources more effectively. It is like a companion to her. It gives her all this like comfort and support in kind of a very like difficult time in her life. And this is one of, I think, the few stories where like tellurium does not come up a whole lot. It does in one part because the smarty pants get stolen by a couple of giants.
Well, it gets stolen by like Chinese like like tumblers or something, and then they give it to the giants for money or something. Like, I just thought that detail was interesting. But anyway, it gets stolen. Yeah, and she comes across like a one of these genetically engineered. When I say dwarfs, like I don't mean like literal dwarfs we have now, but they're called like littleins. Yeah, they're clearly like they're like Tom Thumb sized people. But they're just kind of one of the various like races of people that have been kind of genetically engineered for seemingly no particular reason. Yeah, they're just there. But this littlein has had a tellurium nail driven in, and he like has seen the future and like knows like, oh, if you go to the giant's house and you do XYZ, you can get your smarty pants back, and she does that. And so tellurium does like play into the story, but no one kind of the little girl does not use tellurium. Her family doesn't use tellurium. And I think
that is a story where I think Sorokin kind of shows like a very positive like depiction of like a society, a family of people. You know, the girls' family, they're all pretty kind of salt of the earth people. And I do think there's an element in Sorokin, at least in this book, where he does seem to have kind of this bias towards like kind of a peasant, like agrarian, live and let live kind of mindset.
Yeah. And that crops up again too in the there's a scene where all of the carpenters, so if you want to get a nail beat into your head, you have to contract the surfaces of a carpenter who's extremely trained and also must not really beat the nail into the head of somebody who's too young, because otherwise the chance of them being killed goes up. So anyway, there's all these like traveling carpenters and they're having this kind of like, I wish I could, it sort of reminds me of like a scene in an action movie where all the action people are sitting around like talking like macho-y to each other, but they're not like doing any action. Like it's like a rest period. But anyway, like one of the carpenters essentially describes what the world is like after this Islamic holy war that ravages Europe and reduces the, world to a bunch of city states. And there's more preference towards agrarian living and sort of simple peasant stuff, not political, just kind of like tending your own garden, to kind of quote Candide. But he says, we must not take anyone else's karma upon ourselves, not even in small matters, the brigadier continued, especially now in our renewed post-war world. Take a look at the Eurasian continent. After the collapse of ideological, geopolitical, and technological utopias, it was finally plunged back into the blessed and enlightened Middle Ages. The world returned to human scale. Nations found themselves. Man ceased to be the sum of the technology around him. Mass production is living out its final years. There aren't two identical nails beaten into humanity's head. Man regained a sense of the thing, started to eat healthy grub and ride horses again. Genetic engineering helps man to feel his true size. Man has regained faith in the transcendental, regained his sense of time. We're not rushing anywhere anymore. Most importantly, we understand that there can be no technological heaven on Earth. And in broader terms, no heaven at all. Earth has been given to us as an island of overcoming. Everyone chooses what to overcome and how to overcome it, and they make that choice themselves. And I think that's kind of what you were saying, John, in that like nobody's trying to find the desired utopia, like or if they are, it's not as cool. It's just like hanging out with your farming family and like trying to do stuff. Although even in that example, it's a little different because like the AI is helping that family, but the brigadier here is like, oh, no more technological utopia. And I think that's like, as you were saying, John, kind of like Sorokin kind of tipping his hand a little bit, where a lot of the time he's kind of like concealed.
Yeah, and I mean, I am struggling to find like a reading where we're wrong and that isn't what his thoughts are. But it's very possible we are totally misreading him, especially since he is very playful as an author, and we are reading this in translation. So there is a chance we're missing like a very deft literary or rhetorical move here.
Well, the only other thing I could say is that, like, in terms of if we wanted to have like more of a radical reading, we could say like, this is just another thing that he's presenting you with, another discourse, and he's like, check this one out, post-feudal, this is what people believed. Do you like this? Like, because again, like if we're drawing the comparison that Uffelman wanted to draw between like conceptual art, it's like, do you agree with the brigadier here? Like, is this a good idea? And I think that's where, like, if you think about it too much, it can kind of resemble like tradcath stuff, like simple living, back to the land kind of stuff. But like, again, like I don't think that's like entirely what Sorokin wants either. It's more just like maybe some aspects of it could be good. That's the interesting part with reading him.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because we do spend a couple chapters in kind of the heads of kind of other feudal subjects, because basically it seems like the whole world has been refeudalized outside of kind of these weird like techno enclaves like Moscow or the Republic of Telluria, which we might talk about a little bit later. We spend a couple chapters. Some of the funnier chapters of the book are the ones we spend with kind of aristocratic characters. Yeah. Or kind of in the households of aristocrats. There's a great scene. One of the first chapters is kind of following this hunting party of aristocrats in kind of one of these sort of break off states of the Russian Federation, and there's they all speak in like self-consciously like old-fashioned and literary Russian, and they're basically saying like, yeah, the fact that we like let Russian get like modernized at all is like why our society went to shit. And so we have to all like talk like Tolstoy characters to keep society from collapsing again.
And they're having like this rustic Russian feast while they're having this conversation. And then the text points out that a silver drone flies overhead, which is like the perfect amount of like kind of irony that I usually look for with Sorokin, where it's like these two characters are like, oh, how great it is that we're talking old Russian, we're bringing Russia back, and then like just this drone flies overhead. Like,
are they making Russia great again, Ben?
I mean, according to one of the guys, I think, yeah, right? Isn't that what they're saying? Like, they even talk about the architecture, and it kind of sounds like a Tradcat thing. Like, we're building better buildings.
I think it's interesting. I think that I don't want to be too pat here, but I think there's something to Sorokin's critique where it's kind of like the idea of like the nation is kind of like under modernity, like becomes inherently reactionary. And then maybe like post modernity and like gets even more reactionary.
Yeah, because there's a lot of like violence in this book, and usually it's sort of like nations stealing things from each other or infighting, or like there's a lot of people get killed over the nails themselves, the illicit substance of them.
Well, like there's a lot of like slavery in this book. I think that's kind of one of the things that was striking to me. Oh, yeah. One of the funniest chapters in the book, but also probably one of the bleakest, is we follow, we're in kind of the headspace of a sentient, biologically engineered dildo. That like lives in a colony of dildos in like that's basically like the harem for this like weird like Germano-Russian princess who's just sexually voracious in kind of like a Catherine the Great type of way, and she just like spends all day like fucking these like weird genetically engineered like penis beings,
and they're like trying to get to like a milking place. They're like, oh, it would be a lot better there.
They don't want to go to the milking place.
Oh yeah, they don't want to go there. Yeah
because that's like that's like they have no sentience left when they're there. Like they're just like milked constantly.
Yeah, I like that they're talking about like chest openings a lot. Like that section's voice is always like going like, I'm tired of this chest opening, but he's like running away from this like German princess who's gonna use him for sex essentially.
Yeah, that it was like a funny version of Salo.
Honestly, that's a good when Sorokin is getting into his most like grotesque, it's a funny version of Salo. Like in Blue Lard at one point, Stalin injects blue lard into his brain, and his brain like becomes the size of the planet and kills everyone. like and it's described in like incredible like lurid detail. So. Or
the scene in this book, which trigger warning. There's a chapter later in this book where we're following along with kind of this sort of ingenue who's like gotten off a train in like kind of a bad part of town, and she like is like accosted, captured, and like pretty graphically raped by like two like ruffians, and then she gets like picked up by a car, and we find out that, oh, this is actually like an aristocrat who like disguises herself like to intentionally get raped like as a sexual thrill.
Yeah, and her relation is like, you worry me when you do this, and she goes, well, you have tellurium, and she has like a nail in her head, and then her relation goes, yeah, okay, I see your point, and then that's it. Like,
and it's one of those things where it was a very like kind of jarring scene for me to read because it's pretty horrifying. At first, and then you find out that it's like all this weird con, and it totally recontextualizes all this like grotesquerie that you just witnessed. And you just, I really did not know what to do with that when I was done with it. But I haven't read anything like that this year, so good on Sorokin, I guess.
Yeah, so in Blue Lard, he's a lot more graphic, and I was like waiting for a scene like that, and then it happened. I was like, oh, there it is. Like it's like one of the things that Sorokin got in trouble with originally was one of his short stories involved a girl getting killed and eaten by her own family as sort of like a commentary on Soviet realism, and people thought that Sorokin was being pro-cannibalistic, and that's why the story got banned. So like, yeah, I think he's interested in pushing like basically the boundaries of certain things, but I feel like when he's presenting it again, it's like, oh, this is just what this person is into. What do you think about that? Like that's the kind of like again, it's like presented, and sure, it could be like, you know, aristocratic decadence, but I like that it's just kind of like it's like you were saying, like this weird thing that she's into that's equivocated with Tellurium and is dangerous, but since she's an aristocrat, she has like this people facilitating it, sort of like this like CIA team kind of, or like a security detail rather.
Yeah, like she's really like being followed like the whole time by like people who are going to like keep things from getting too out of hand.
Yeah.
But it's still like we don't know that going into it.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
And so you kind of get blindsided like twice over, which again, I can't think of anything else I've read this year that has like kind of punched me in the face like twice over the course of like 10 pages.
Yeah, and to be clear, that's probably the most graphic bit in the book, I think, if we're talking about all of the stuff, although it does, well, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it is. I can't think of anything that's worse than that.
I think it probably is. I in my supplementary reading, I read kind of some descriptions, because Sorokin is definitely like known to be like, oh, this like guy loves like talking about like shit and cum and like people like, yeah, like eating their families or like raping their moms and like being very like intentionally provocative.
Yeah.
In a way that I felt like this book kind of avoided. Because after I read that, I kind of was like bracing myself for to get like a real weird and gross. Not because I like can't handle that stuff, but just because, you know,
gotta be prepared.
If you know it's coming, it's like you kind of can't help it.
Yeah,
at least be a little braced for it. But I definitely feel like this book did not like. I was that was probably the scene that I like felt most kind of shocked by, and even then, like it wasn't like, you know, I wanted to throw up afterwards, but it was just a very like kind of effective, like turn, like plot twist, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and also I think some of that kind of restrainedness is because like I think this is like later in his career, because from what I can tell, initially he writes all these binary bomb stories where, you know, like they start off as Soviet realism and then somebody gets eaten or killed or like defecated. And then he has sort of a period where he's like more transgressive, like the norm involves like a section of the norm involves Soviet people having to eat shit as part of the government ration, where they're given like shit as from the government and they have to consume it. But anyway, like and then he kind of like takes a break. Then he writes Blue Lard, and then he kind of has like a kind of restrained period, and that's like where this one is from. And I think that's why it kind of gets recommended as like a starting point, as opposed to like Blue Lard or like the Q or something like that.
Well, Blue Lard is the one that really pissed off like kind of Russian nationalists, right?
Yeah, because of there's a gay sex scene between Khrushchev and Stalin that's quite explicit.
But yeah, I could this definitely felt like a book written by someone who kind of hit like a certain point and kind of like transgression, realized like, oh, maybe there is like some value in restraining myself a little bit.
Well, so I really want to read Day of the Oporichnik, which apparently is like, we're doing Russia neo-feudalism, but it's way more brutal and upsetting. And this is like a more like mellow version of this kind of neo-feudalism tack. They even reference brutal oporichniks in this book, which I think is Sorokin doing a kind of like in-universe thing. But like this was written after Day of the Oporichnik, so I kind of want to read that, although I've heard it's quite brutal and upsetting. So
Ben, I'm sure you could handle it.
I that's the thing that's interesting to me about him is like he's hard to pin down. He's extremely gifted as a stylist, but you can never quite know exactly what's happening. Like, I always feel like there's something, like, that's the thing. Like, people say he's a satirist, but I feel like a lot of his satire is not so clear. Like, it's not entirely clear. Like, sure, things are exaggerated, things are being made fun of, but there's no like clear position that he's standing on. Like, there is what he believes personally, probably, but that's only kind of hinted at in his actual writing.
Yeah, it's not kind of, I guess, I'll be frank, I'm not like a big Russian lit head. I don't know a ton about Russian literature as a rule. My interests lie a little further south in the great land of China, as far as translated literature goes. But something I do think is interesting is yeah, like you said, Ben, this is definitely not like Swiftian, like Anglo satire, where the whole point is just kind of exaggerating to the point of like you can't really miss the point unless you're the biggest moron in the world.
Right.
Which obviously there are plenty of people who do misread satire all the time. But where was I going with this? But yeah, I do wonder if some of that is just reading in translation and maybe us not knowing quite all the things he's referencing. You know, I will give like full credit to Max Lawton. He's clearly an incredibly talented translator. This book did not feel like stiff or hard to read, like, even though I think you can tell it's translated just kind of because of some of the weird turns the prose takes. The chapter that's like written in like Old English
for the centaur,
which apparently in the original book is an Old Church Slavonic for some reason.
That's interesting.
That's one where I'm like, I feel like this must be some reference to something, but I don't know what it is. But I almost like kind of wish that there had been like a little bit more like footnoting about like what references are to.
Yeah, I feel like Lawton only kind of talks about that in interviews, and not in the book itself.
And I definitely like, I see the argument for not putting that in there, and just presenting the text as it is and like letting you, the reader, like have your experience with it. There are definitely times when like I've had access to footnotes in a translated text and I've ignored them and just kind of had my time with the text and then maybe reference back to things later or not at all. But I always like having the option.
Yeah, there's an interesting line that I was reading some of the interviews where Lawton was talking about working with Sorokin, and he would be like, you know, if we translate it this way, we could pick up on like more of the nuances in the original Russian. And Sorokin goes, I don't want symbolism, which I think one is really funny, and two, like really clear with what he's doing, where it's like, this is the discourse itself. I don't want it to stand in for like some symbol that like we could tease out if I wanted to get more of the like the old Slavonic Russian or like something else. And so like Lawton is like, he said he'll and there's one interview where he's like I don't want to undercook it or overcook it. I want to have like the right amount of translation so that if somebody wanted to, they could add footnotes and talk about some of the nuances. But the goal is to just get it in like literary English, basically.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I can't fault him at all. Like it's really, I think, a really marvelous piece of work in terms of just the smoothness of the translation. Like, yeah, I've read far worse translations, and I mean, I don't want to put it that way because I think that's underselling Lawton's work a little bit. But I think probably because it's something where, again, Sorokin being kind of an author who's just getting kind of his roses in the Anglosphere. Yeah. There's not a whole lot of other places to go to like look for that kind of supplemental reading. Like, I'm definitely going to check out that book you mentioned earlier by Mr. Awfulman. Because I definitely feel like there's stuff in Telluria, and I think probably in kind of just Sorokin's oeuvre more generally that I'm missing, and that, you know, my reading would be enriched by. But Yeah, I think, hey, if that's what he wants, if Sorokin does not want there to be kind of a lot of context or like too much kind of cooking of the words to kind of to make it obvious to us, dumb monolinguals here in the States. Hey, good on him. I will always credit an author for sticking to his guns over doing what makes things easier for a dumb provincial like me.
Well, speaking of references, that Elfman book was useful for the chapter where they actually go to the Republic of Telluria. And according to Elfman, there are multiple references to Putin's essentially anti-NATO stance in that chapter, as well as there being references to the Eurasianist belief that the Altai part of Russia was the cradle of civilization, which is some sort of like Dugin sort of revisionist history nationalist bullshit. But in the book, the president of the Republic of Telluria, who is French, which Uffelman also points out might be a reference to another French Eurasianist. Anyway, he's like this James Bond character, and he has like a jetpack, and he flies over the heads of all of these feudal peasants, and they're puffing out smoke, and they're saying, we love you, Mr. President. And then like Mr. President like comes down and has like a nice broth with these peasants, like, and the whole thing I think is like supposed to be like, oh, this is like some person's belief in like a Eurasianist president who's like technologically proficient and like anti-West, like, and it's also like kind of ludicrous because it becomes like James Bondian, and then he has like an orgy at the end, like he does cocaine with furries, and then he does cocaine, and the text is like he never did too much cocaine or something, like and it's like, oh, our perfect leader, we love you, or something, like, and then like that's like where the tellurium nails are coming from, and like, and then you just leave that behind and then you go somewhere else. But like the book was that extra book was useful for pointing out like various references. Also, apparently, whenever they talk about a president who flew with cranes, Putin actually did that in 2007. Like he was flying in a plane or something with a bunch of like indigenous crane birds that were flying, and like this like very like weird I don't, I'm trying to think of the equivalent in America. It would be like if Biden was parachuting with eagles or something. Like it was like so, like sort of like
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, see, like that would be cool. But like apparently Putin did that, and so like like Sorokin like makes reference to it a couple of times. But it's, I don't know. The Lawton makes the language really pop, though, I think is the big thing. And I think while he could have maybe like had it made it pop even more, according to Sorokin, like, no symbols. We don't want any symbols. So,
well, I mean, again, I think I did appreciate that to some degree, because there was never a time when I was reading this where I found myself kind of not feeling insulted. That's not the right word, but like, I never felt like I was getting beaten over the head with a metaphor.
Yeah.
Like I didn't really worry about this, but I definitely like kind of knowing, oh, like I'm reading like a Russian satirist. So I was kind of like, oh, is there going to be like a weird thing where like there's going to be a character who's clearly like Vladimir Putin? And it's going to be like this really like, I mean, I don't really know how like dissident Russians, for lack of a better term, like kind of what their stereotypes of like Putin as a guy is. I can only kind of go off of like what American liberals think of him, which is just like, oh, he's Hitler. I'm not a Putin fan or anything, but it's just like, I don't know.
There's another Sorokin book where apparently like he redoes the trick with the clones from Blue Lard, except they're these weird like political being creatures, and one of them is Vladimir Putin, but all he can say is, it's not me. Is what his character just says over and over again, is it's not me, which I think is like supposed to be like because his name is Vladimir, but also like that's all Putin is allowed to say. Like, yeah, I think Sorokin's like a better satirist than that. Like if he is making a reference to Putin, it's like it's veiled, like
I never felt like I was like getting beaten over the head with a metaphor and kind of like having my intelligence insulted, despite again the fact that I did feel like I was probably missing some things. I don't know. Again, like to kind of come across like a little lukewarm, maybe I'm like, I always felt like it hit like just the right balance between like making me feel like I was getting enough to get something out of the text without like making me feel like I was doing homework the whole time. Even though I'm a freak who maybe would have liked a little extra homework.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I clearly did that too, because I was like, I want to know a little bit more, and also because my friend had pointed out, like, is that a reference to Dugan? And I was like, I need to find this out. It's like,
so as we kind of proceed, so a couple things that I wanted to hit on as we kind of keep going through this text. What did you think of the way kind of non-Russian powers are kind of portrayed in the book? I thought that kind of the way China is portrayed in the book is interesting.
Yeah.
And I know Sorokin kind of has some interesting China stuff in some of his other books. I know Blue Lard like largely takes place in kind of like a Chinese pidgin language.
Yeah, and in Blue Lard, essentially, like, one of the main characters for a big chunk of the book, they're basically like Chinese is so infiltrated this Russian scientist that he like speaks in Russian mixed with Chinese slang, and the slang is like very like directly translated as opposed to being like a figure of speech, apparently. And there are some references to that in this too, although he doesn't really explore them as in detail in Blue Lard. And I think to me, like, part of it has to do with his kind of like sci-fi setting where it's like, yeah, China's just advanced. Like in Blue Lard, one character goes, this decade is the Chinese decade at one point is what someone says. And presumably this is like in the future, you know, where like we could produce clones of writers, but that's Blue Lard. I feel like in this, it's like, yeah, China's just kind of like infiltrating more of the world in terms of like speech or something.
Well, it's interesting because one thing that really a country that basically never comes up in the book at all is America.
Yeah.
Like I can't think off the top of my head of like a single reference to America or like an American character appearing. And so I kind of wonder if there's an element where Sorokin is at the very least looking to China as kind of like, if not the future, like kind of like a power that Russia or whatever Russia is like turning into, like kind of needs to orient itself towards, like, because that's like where the future is happening.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty much it, because like, and at least in Blue Lard, it's implied that some like nuclear explosion happened in the US in this future setting. So like, I think, yeah, it's like, it's sort of like this cosmopolitan multipolar world that like China is like a bit more, you know, in the front of.
I mean, they're pretty good at that.
Yeah. And again, like, I think too that like I think you had mentioned that in that scene where those two young people are like having sex virtually, there's a couple references to Chinese slang, but it's sort of like, yeah, they're kind of like, they're a cultural presence in the world that this book takes, you know, is set in.
Well, I mean, one of the big things in that chapter on the President Telluria is that he's trying to open up a passage to sell tellurium to China and Vietnam.
And also that was Putin's stance that we're orienting away from the US, because that was part of his like anti-NATO thing. He's like, we don't want the US, we're going to sell goods directly to China. So like that, there's also like that going on too.
Interesting.
They even constructed that gas line recently, although I don't know if that actually started yet. I don't know if you were following that. That was a year or two ago. Putin and President Xi were like, I don't know, I'm just going to go into Trump voice. We got a great, big, beautiful gas line right to China. Like, and then I don't think they like actually built it. So like, I don't know, but yeah.
I do know that like, I think China has been exporting a lot of Russian gas since the Ukraine conflict started, since China is kind of taking a fairly neutral stance on that war.
Right.
You know, I obviously they are buying goods from Russia, but they're not, I don't believe, providing any kind of direct military support by any means. But yeah, I do think that's interesting. You know, again, just given my own personal interests, I find kind of the place that China plays in like a text to be interesting.
Oh yeah. By the way, did you catch the reference to Romance of the Three Kingdoms?
Where was that?
That was when everyone goes over to the house because they've procured one tellurium nail.
Yes.
Yeah. And they draw lots for it, but like there's just like a copy of Romance of the Three Kingdoms that they didn't like use the paper for because it says like I don't have a lot of paper, so they like rip a page out of Romance of the Three Kingdoms to like do the lots to see who gets to try the tellurium nail.
Man, if I could use a tellurium nail, I'd love to hang out with all my boys. Liu Bei, Guan Yu, Zhang Fei, Cao Cao. I'd have so much fun using tellurium to go back and do Dynasty Warriors for real.
See, okay, that's the thing about tellurium. It's like, do you just get the thing you want, or can you like think about the thing you want, and then when you get the nail banged in, you just get that?
So I think that is kind of an ambiguity to the text, and I think that is something I appreciated about it. Like, there's never a part in this book where he like totally like just has a character be like, this is exactly how tellurium works.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Like, it's always left pretty ambiguous and kind of like not quite magical realist. I think it goes a little beyond that, but it's always left ambiguous in kind of the way I think that, you know, kind of drugs in real life a lot of times feel ambiguous. Like when you drop acid, like what does it actually like do, like psychologically versus physiologically, like what does that all mean? But I think one of the most interesting bits of the book is one of the parts that really plays with tellurium use in kind of a personal way, and that's I think the third to last chapter, which we referenced earlier, which is the one that takes place in the ultra Stalinist socialist Soviet Republic, where we kind of follow this kind of educated bohemian like gay German couple who are like visiting kind of this country, which is apparently this kind of very small breakaway state from the Russian Federation that was founded by Stalinists,
oligarchs,
like basically like a very like small like cadre of like Stalinist like oligarch bureaucrats who like claimed this land and like basically closed it off and like didn't let like people come there so they could just turn it into like Stalinist Disneyland. But there's an interesting bit where like one of the couple has used tellurium pretty extensively in the past. Yeah. And he's like a philosopher. And so he's like used tellurium to like go back and visit Plato. And it says like he couldn't find like a common language to communicate in, so they just like made out and had sex.
Yeah, and he's like, he can still taste the philosopher's tongue or something. Like it's, that's like one of the throwaway lines.
Yeah, but then also like he apparently like through this kind of weird power tellurium has to kind of like blend like past and present, but also like commune with the dead. Like he like brings like Sartre and like Baudrillard to like debate with Plato about whether or not anything's real. Yeah. So there's kind of this element where it's like it's kind of giving you what you want, but again, like tellurium for the most part doesn't seem to like doesn't save you. Like it's not like it like you still like come back to our world and like there's still like some level of incompleteness to like what you saw or experienced that you like either need to find a way to bridge or you need to try to like again immanentize the eschaton in your own life or in the world as you experience it. But it is interesting in the case of the gay couple because they basically like the piece de résistance in the Stalinist Disneyland, if you like buy the like special package, they like beat a tellurium nail in your head at like the end of like your last night, and you get to like go and meet Stalin in the 1930s.
My night with Stalin. Like,
meet the big dog when he was on top of the world. And they do that and they die like immediately.
They die, and then the narration goes, that's how it happened, and it just like ends right there.
But it's also like this was not common. Like even people who didn't like Stalin and did this, like they're like one lady like did it and like came out of her trip and like wrote a book called like I Spat in Stalin's Face.
And then there was somebody who had like a business improvement by meeting with Stalin. Like he met with Stalin and then he like quadrupled his profit margin or something. Like
business secrets of the general secretaries.
Yeah, but so then they die, and I think that's the only time there's an overdose in the book, although it's alluded to that it can happen, right?
Yeah, it's alluded to pretty much as soon as we kind of learn what tellurium does, kind of what this thing is and like how it's used. They basically explain kind of from the jump to oh yeah, even if you have a carpenter and you're of the proper age, there's still a pretty decent chance that you might OD if the nail goes in slightly off kilter.
Yeah, and when all the carpenters are talking, they're exchanging stories of when they had a bad nail and somebody dies in one person's thing, but then other times they save people. So
yeah. There's that whole bit about the nail puller in one of those stories. So it's not always a total death sentence, but it can be. And I this was a bit where this story with the gay couple and the sort of Soviet theme park. It was a scene that I got to the end of that and I really didn't know what to make of it. I felt like it was this thing. And again, maybe this gets into kind of, are we missing something? Is there something here to miss? Is this Sorokin just kind of being kind of playful and maybe trolling us a little bit? I don't know, but I sat with it and I was trying to figure what is this symbolic of something? Is this allegorical in some way? Is this a joke that I'm not getting? The only thing I could figure is if it's a joke, is it just oh, Stalin doesn't like gay people?
Yeah, and or so yeah.
But that feels so pat. I can't really believe that that's it.
Yeah, to me, I thought it was interesting that it's implied that the philosopher member of the couple, his father realized that now his son could actually study philosophy. So I wondered if there was an implication that if the other chapters in the book had taken place immediately after or not long after the giant war that reduced Europe into kind of a feudal territory, this was far enough that there's some sort of modernization happening again. We can have these two people study philosophy and not live on an agrarian subsistence farm, and then they go to the Soviet kitsch museum and die. There's something about Soviet kitschness being deadly even in this future. It was oh, okay, actually we're not really that modernized and you can still die going to the kitsch state. I don't know, there I found the reference to the father, the text says something Patrick's father had awoken as if from a slumber and realized in the future his son could succeed studying philosophy. So there's this kind of this idea that oh, it's okay if he gets into philosophy, he doesn't have to I don't know, become an electrician or something. So that's how I took it. Although, again, this is what I was saying earlier. It's sometimes hard to determine exactly what the satire is. You get this kind of weird frisson or whatever when I read him, where I'm just whatever's happening is very strange and weird, and I kind of know what's going on, but not exactly.
Well, I think that's actually kind of where I think that's where the tension really cropped up for me in this chapter, because I think in terms of satire, I think that this chapter is one of the ones that is the most kind of, maybe just because we get so much propaganda about the cult of personality around Stalin and stuff, in kind of American education. I felt the satire here was pretty, maybe not blunt, but legible to me as an American subject. I like that there's a reference to the fact that the ultra-Stalinist Soviet Socialist Republic is a fully service-based economy. There's no industrial production whatsoever.
Yeah, I thought that was
it tamps down on class conflicts.
Yeah, it's just everybody is in the service industry.
Yeah, everyone works in tourism or tourism support, which I found to be pretty funny, actually. But because it was pretty legible on that level, when there is kind of this weird depressing kind of mysterious coda, I was well, surely there must be something more going on here that I'm not getting.
Yeah, and two, That's also kind of a reference to like Soviet realism too. Like a lot of Soviet realism stuff is about production, and in this one it's just like all service industry, no production. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe like it's weird that he sort of had to have the tragedy happen where it doesn't happen, and for the rest of them that they just end up like victims of kitsch or something. Like, you know, like they got too into the myth of the big man, you know, or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know. I'd love to go back and meet the big dog, though. I'd have a great time doing that.
Yeah, right. My dinner with Stalin. Yeah, yeah.
I'd ask him for mustache tips.
That reminds me, there's a bit in the Golden Notebook which is not the same genre of this book, but she writes this piece where she goes, it's a story of a man who is basically like, I get to meet Stalin. He's like an Orthodox communist. He's like, I finally get to meet Stalin. And he basically meets with Stalin, and Stalin's working really deep into the night, and he's like sweating, and he's like, oh, thank God you're here. And then like the main protagonist just goes like, have you thought about this obvious thing? And Stalin goes, you're a genius. Like, and the guy goes, oh, thank God I could help Father Stalin. And then he leaves. And in the Golden Notebook, she writes it as a parody, and she brings it to her political meeting because she's an Orthodox communist, and nobody at the meeting can detect that it's parody. They all go, wow, what a great story. Like, well,
that reminds me of the, not to like keep going like level and level here, but I found myself in that chapter thinking about, I'm sure you've seen the Slavoj Zizek classic, The Pervert's Guide to Cinema.
Banger. Yeah.
And there's the bit where he's talking about like the Soviet like basically a romantic comedy that Stalin like does a cameo in to give like dating advice to this like peasant. And it's like, well, of course Stalin has to know like exactly how you talk to a woman.
Isn't that also the one where Zizek points out and Stalin was actually deathly afraid of crowds? Like so like he like has to like appear above people or something in that movie, or like, yeah.
But yeah, I found like the idea of like, oh yeah, you get to like go back in time and meet Stalin, like to be this very interesting thing, kind of for that reason. I don't know. I'm very skeptical of like a lot of Western rhetoric around like cults of personality for political leaders. Like, Americans have no room to talk about that. We have Mount fucking Rushmore, which is 10 times kitschier than the ultra-Stalinist socialist Soviet Republic would be if it was real.
Speaking of which, what did you think about that scene where they find the statues of the 3 Russian presidents?
That was where I wanted to go next. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah.
So there 3 of kind of the most interconnected stories. So it's a series of 3 chapters towards the end of the book where we follow this trio, a brother, a sister, and their grandmother.
Yeah.
And the grandmother brings them out to this like spot in the wilderness where their grandfather, who is presumably passed away at this point, has carved kind of a Mount Rushmore to the 3 bald men who's basically, as she puts it, like fought the dragon of Russia and won. Basically the 3 men who like killed the 3 like incarnations of the Russian state, but they never mentioned them by name, like who these figures are. I think so. You know, she says like the first one killed the Russian Empire, the second one killed the Soviet Union, the third one killed the Russian Federation, and like led to the world as it is now. The post-Russia, you know, I think it's implied that the collapse of the Russian Federation is what led to this Islamic invasion and kind of this refeudalization of Europe.
Yes. I
don't know if we mentioned that, but that's definitely the reading I got. And I think that's interesting because the first one's obviously Lenin. Right. But I have no idea who the other 2 are.
Well, I think it's got to be Putin, and then the middle one I don't know.
Bold.
Well, I mean, but like, who else would it? It's got to be. I mean, Putin looks balder now.
I guess. I mean, I guess that makes sense because they make a big show of like the grandmother like is always talking about like everything that the third man like had to sacrifice and give up, and like how he had to look like the bad guy to like finally kill Russia once and for all. Well, it kind of reminded me of like the way that like like MAGA people talk about Trump, where they're like, oh, he gave up his life of being like a businessman with the who just had fun all day to be president and save our country.
He was so successful. Yeah.
I had a great life.
Yeah.
I had a wonderful life.
Well, they made, yeah. I'd love to just leave, drive off. Yeah, just get one of those things and drive away. Like,
but I have to slay the dragon of Russia.
Well, I think it's Putin, because there's that dialogue later where they're like, wasn't the last guy, didn't he fly with cranes? And they're like, yeah, but he's not president anymore. So I think
that makes sense, because I didn't know about that. So
I think it's Lenin, Putin, and then maybe Khrushchev, not Khrushchev. Who's the guy that oversaw the fall of the Soviet Union?
I mean Yeltsin, but I don't know if Yeltsin's bald either.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, I guess. I mean, it might be something where, depending on again Sorokin's like personal feelings, like he might have been like Yeltsin, like presided over the formal dissolution of the USSR.
Okay.
Maybe he's drawing that line earlier at like, Khrushchev or Gorbachev.
Yeah.
That definitely feels like the one where they mentioned that one the least. They mentioned the person who killed the Soviet Union the least of the three.
Yeah, and I also like too that like one sibling really likes the place that they go for lunch and the other one doesn't. like
Yeah, well, because again, like the first chapter is the like grandson's perspective, the second chapter is the granddaughter's perspective, and then the third chapter is the grandmother's perspective. And so we see this kind of same scene from three different perspectives.
Yeah.
And kind of get three kind of slightly different reads on the situation with these statues. But I did find that really interesting. I kind of, again, found the idea of like, I'm not an expert on Russia, Russian history, Russian literature, but I think there are maybe like some parallels I can see in terms of like America as like this kind of thing where it's like, oh, we forged this thing out of all these different things.
The 50 states. Yeah.
Like, actually, that's bad. Actually, that's like a problem. And actually, like, we need to kill the nation, like, to ever make any progress, even if that, like, looks like collapse. I'm not sure if it's a viewpoint I would say I agree with, but it's definitely like a viewpoint I can see the logic of.
Right. And as you had said, I think he's not necessarily saying it's like there's a little bit of romanticization of what that would look like, where you tend your own garden, you have an agrarian lifestyle, you're not really worried about too much political movement, like you're kind of like you're watching your own plot of land, like when the carpenter says we don't rush around anymore, we're not trying to find technological utopia. The one that I like is we don't take anyone's karma on for our own. I thought that was interesting, but yeah, there's kind of like maybe it wouldn't be so bad if that happens.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because I think that Russia is an interesting country from the standpoint that there is this. I think, again, America's weird. I think that like the collapse of America like feels apocalyptic because like as Americans, we can't picture anything else. We don't have like a deeper history to like draw on.
Right.
Like we don't have like a deeper relationship to the land or anything like that. And I don't want to like romanticize too much, or I also don't want to like be like Sorokin is like a blood and soil guy or anything like that. But I think that like probably like kind of the average Russian, at least maybe in certain parts of the country, like they have a more rooted sense of the world because their families lived in a certain place for a really long time. And, maybe the collapse of this thing would feel less alienating because it is this imposed thing rather than this thing that like they're an active part of the construction of. But I don't know. That also feels like I'm maybe orientalizing in a way.
Yeah, right. And that's why I think it's interesting, too, that he incorporates these kind of like nationalistic propaganda references, because he's like he's clearly not, subscribing to them. He's sort of like toying with them and being like subjugating them to like look at what would be like obviously he's not saying like we need to do this, but like there's a direction where you force all of these parts together versus like a direction where they all fall apart. And there's probably like a middle ground somewhere.
Well, I think so. Let me maybe make kind of a somewhat what's the word I'm looking for? Not parallel, not perpendicular. I'm going to make kind of maybe a comparison that's not going to be super obvious at first, but I'm going to try to like lay out my thoughts here. I just finished yesterday evening. I finished Twin Peaks: The Return.
Oh yeah, banger number 2. Yeah.
I'm not going to spoil too much of Twin Peaks: The Return for the like 5 other people who still haven't seen it. I can't believe that show came out 7 years ago. I over the last like couple of years have been like, I'm gonna get to that soon, and then it's been like the better part of a decade since it came out, and I just didn't even realize. Anyway, my point being, one of the kind of the key lines at the end of that show is, we all live in a dream, more or less, and kind of this idea of like a collective dream, not as like a thing that is consciously willed into existence, but kind of this thing that arises, kind of out of the collective unconscious, for lack of a better term, into the real world. And then like you kind of have to deal with one way or the other.
Yeah, we were like the dreamer who thinks that the dream is real. Yeah. So.
And I think that that's kind of what Russia is for Sorokin. Like there's this element where this book is, again, kind of all these disparate people kind of living in the wake of this collapsed thing.
Yeah.
And some of them are like trying to dream it back into existence. Some of it are kind of just living in like the dreams that it left behind.
Definitely.
And kind of the idea that, again, I think that what I keep coming back to with this book is that I don't necessarily know that it's saying this stuff is evil, just saying that like it's a thing that exists and kind of it will never be permanent. I something we didn't get to in this conversation, there's one chapter that takes place from the perspective of a Buddhist dragon.
Yeah.
And that kind of got me thinking about kind of my particular kind of hangups with kind of Buddhist ontology and kind of things arising and falling away. And I think that for Sorokin, like I think there is kind of a Buddhist read in this book where it's kind of this thing where Russia is not ontologically real.
Yeah.
It is this phenomenon that like exists and then falls away, and then like in its falling away, it creates all these waves that are equally transient. Like I don't think there's any implication over the course of this book that any of these like breakaway republics or mini city states, none of these things are going to last. Like they are equally, we're not really entering like a new, more stable time necessarily.
Right. Yeah.
We're entering just kind of a new set of phenomenon, and those are going to fall away eventually and like lead to something new. And I don't totally know what to make of that, but I think that kind of this idea of the way that collective dreams, collective beliefs, collective desires shape the world, but can never actually fulfill us and just kind of lead to more dreams and ideas and desires. Like, I think that is very present in this text, and I think very fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up too, because it's like, yeah, it just kind of leads to more, tellurium or more desire or more dreaming, as opposed to like, this is the one, that's why I also, and I don't necessarily agree with this reading 100%, think the nails are sort of like unity, like the feeling of unity, like you feel one with something. And I think,
you feel one with history.
Yeah. And that's kind of like, as you were saying, I think eloquently, John, that's kind of like the dream. And, then you fall out of it because you're not always one with history. So then you have to keep doing it again. And I think that's also the way it can kind of apply nicely to America, where it feels very solid and bedrock, but we don't know what the future might look like. So
There's a scene I wanna read from the perspective of this Buddhist dragon that I kind of gets to some of these themes that I just kind of want to share, because I for me this was kind of an affecting portion, and I like it. A blood-sucking insect had moved in with him. Every night it crept out of its crack to gorge itself on Viktor Olegovich's blood. As a Buddhist, he wasn't against this. On the contrary, it brought him great pleasure to feel the bites and the subsequent loss of blood through the veil of Maya that is sleep. As it sates itself, this being makes me more consummate, he would think in his sleep. I let this younger being suck at me. This ain't no managerial style. During the day, he would sometimes pray briefly for his new blood brother. But one thing remained unclear. Each time it finished gorging itself on Viktor Olegovich's blood, the insect let forth a particular noise, something like a discontinuous churr. It was rhythmic in its discontinuity, and as it spoke tonally, the sound was also organized in a particular way. The insect made this noise every night. It was the sound of satisfaction and perhaps even gratitude. He's thanking me. I'm thanking him. And together we are necessarily thanking the great wheel of samsara, because for as long as we are dependent upon it, we must be in its spokes. Humility is the lubricant of these luminous spheres.
I forgot also that it ends with, I'm not going to think about the third one, which to me is a very David Lynchian line.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because he's like looking at like his succulent Chinese meal. He looks at the last sesame seed on the plate, and he's like, I'm not going to think about this.
Yeah, because you imagine David Lynch saying, like, I'm not going to think about the third one. You know, or it's like, you know, it's like
I'm going to go out and have another 20 cigarettes.
Yeah. Did you see he can't leave the house now? I mean,
yeah.
It fucking sucks.
He loves cigarettes too much. But I kind of like it because he doesn't like, he's kind of not self-pitying. He's like, yeah, I just love smoking too much. Cigarettes sure were cool.
I have emphysema. Yeah, like, I mean, yeah, he just kind of owned it. Yeah, like he's
good on him.
Yeah, the Buddhist dragon chapter, I honestly don't know what to think about it, so I think you bringing it up is a better read than I could have come up with. So, like, I read that and I just thought, huh? And then I was like, I didn't have anything else. But
well, I found it interesting. We didn't really get into it, but Sorokin is apparently a pretty devout Christian, but I found that little passage to be a pretty interesting little exploration of kind of Buddhist, or at least a certain type of like Buddhist ethic.
Yeah, like letting the insect, yeah. And I don't know if there's even a reference to Telluria in that chapter either.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'd have to go back and read through it. It's a really odd chapter because, again, it's about a genetically engineered dragon.
And he's like chewing on his tail. Yeah.
It's definitely one of the more like esoteric chapters outside of the parts about Buddhism, which is kind of weird to say because you'd think the Buddhist parts would be the more esoteric parts, but the other parts are way more confusing when he's just describing his day-to-day life.
Yeah, he's chewing his tail. Yeah, he's looking at sesame seeds. He's like thinking about the wheel of samsara. So,
are there any like specific chapters you want to like give the roses to?
I think I guess I already kind of did, but I did think the chapter where that woman explains the sacrifices that she went through, why that lead to her being in a position of political power that may or may not be fucking other people over. Like that seemed particularly affecting to me.
Actually,
because
let's do that because I have a couple that I want to bring up. So.
Okay, cool. So I think, John, since there's a lot of different chapters, I think it would be useful just to go over quickly which ones we liked. And as I was saying, I think the one where that woman reveals her heart tattoo to kind of justify the sacrifices she made to realize the future that she wants, but also with the implication that maybe some people are getting fucked over by the decisions she's making, is I think to be pretty affecting in terms of like, this is the price that I'm paying to be, one with the history that I think is real. And it is affecting other people. Like, I don't know. It felt very like, here's the cost that's being paid, kind of.
I like that one too. I think one of my favorite chapters, and one that we surprisingly did not get to at all, is chapter 22, which is the brief play. There are a couple of chapters that are told in the form of like dialogue.
Yeah.
Where it's two dog-headed like men. Because that's another thing that exists in this world, not just like giants and dwarves and centaurs. There's also like furries, basically. There's two like kynocephali consuming like corpses on a battlefield and just kind of
one is a philosopher, the other a poet.
Yeah, they're just kind of like waxing philosophic and lyric as they eat like the brains of like dead soldiers. And like at one point, one of them accidentally like bites a Telluria nail that's been beaten into like one of the soldiers' heads, and he's like, "Ouch, my teeth!" But I really like that chapter because Ben, after society collapses, this is what I kind of think our life is going to be like. This is what we're going to have in lieu of the podcast. It's just going to be us. Filthy and nude, crouched over the bodies of dead soldiers, eating their brains for sustenance.
Yeah, we're gonna be riffing.
As we riff and talk about what books used to be like.
I was a big fond of alcohol. Is always apropos, isn't that so? Although for real dogs, it's poison. It's hard to imagine life without alcohol. That would truly be a dog's life. That's probably why all dogs have such sad eyes. Yeah. So I thought that was like also essentially Waiting for Godot. Like it was essentially like the Waiting for Godot scene where like they're killing time and they're like kind of getting on each other's nerves, but then they do like agree. So
yeah, I'd say other than those two, I really like the chapter about the president of Telluria and kind of just his incredibly fun seeming life, and then the chapter with the penis harem, which I just found very, very funny.
Yeah, also the centaur chapter, because it was kind of sad. Like the centaur is like he gets really upset. like so.
Yeah, and I'm always like kind of a sucker for like Old English like spellings and pronunciations. I just always really like kind of that register.
Yeah.
I don't know if I ever told you, Ben, about a book I read a couple years ago that's literally like completely written in like Old English like vernacular.
I don't think so.
It's called The Wake. Let me find the author. By Paul Kingsnorth. It's a book that takes place in the wake of like the Norman invasion. It's about like an Old English guy like grappling with that, and it's just a very cool book from the standpoint. It's very interesting to kind of see Old English like just really front and center. That
sounds dope.
A Fearthid. I just really love all those weird little pronunciations, and I almost wish that they'd gone all the way and replaced the THs with the Thor.
Also, the last one I'll say is there's a deal of a Tellurium deal that goes wrong, and the guy ends up getting killed, and it's told in like one kind of run-on, not really run-on, where the sentences have a way of like rolling into each other. And I felt that was like a chapter 18. I felt that was an effective bit of like crime writing. Like it just seemed like the deal goes wrong. He gets screwed over by like, I guess an Arab guy, basically, and he gets killed. But like just the way the chapter goes, it's a nice bit of like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I was dead, basically, like because the deal goes wrong. I thought that was cool. Apparently, I actually checked out the Ice trilogy, which is ones that people of Sorokin's that they don't like. But apparently he spends a lot of crime writing in those, like a lot of time spent with Russian gangsters. So I'm interested to check those out.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty astounding. Like, again, I don't know how much of this is necessarily him and how much of this is Lawton's skill as well. But the different like kind of registers that he moves throughout the book are just so like deft. Like,
yeah,
there are so many parts of this book where it's like I could read a whole book written in this voice and probably like have a great time with it. And it's just like, no, I'm just gonna do this for a chapter. Fuck you. I'm not getting any more.
Honestly, I think that's a good description of Sorokin, is just, I'm just gonna do this for a little bit and then fuck you, because it's like that's basically what the binary bombs are. That's basically blue lard. Yeah, the Q is kind of the same thing all the way through, but those of all the threes I've read, I think it's more often than not that he's more content to shift gears as soon as he like says what he needs to say. So
yeah, it's impressive. I mean, there are so many authors who can't even pull off one voice, let alone 50 of them.
Yeah, right. It's true.
It's true, unfortunately. Well, Ben, thanks for a great pick.
Yeah, thanks for reading with me, John.
Absolutely. So, couple quick announcements before we sign off for the evening. Ben and I are going to take a little bit of a summer vacation here as we prepare to go into season 2. We're going to be taking just a kind of fortnight break. We'll be back in 4 weeks with a new episode. We will actually have an episode for you in 2 weeks at your regularly scheduled time. It's going to be the episode we promised back at the beginning of the summer with Phil Ford of Weird Studies. But in the meantime, we will be getting ready for season 2, and we will have an announcement of what we're going to be reading for you guys who read along with us. We have some kind of big plans for season 2.
And feel free to email us as well, like in the interim. We'd love to hear from you guys. Any comments, any feedback?
Yeah, as we kind of really look towards the future of this project, we definitely would love to hear from you guys kind of what you like about the show, what you think we could be doing better. We really appreciate the kind of core we've built here, and we hope you guys are telling people about the show and enjoying it. We really love that you guys are listening to us and enjoying our conversation. We definitely want to, I think, start building more opportunities for like interaction with you guys. We want to hear what you guys think about what we're reading and what you think of the show. So yeah, please email us. We have some other plans that are going to be coming down the pipes here, so keep an eye out for those. Ben, do you have anything else for the nice people?
This has been great, John. I love doing this with you, and yeah, if you like what we do, let us know. That's always nice to hear.
Yeah, we're on X, the everything site at iLibPod.
It's all happening on X, John.
You can email the show at you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. That's about it for socials at the moment, but I know we're also looking at that here for season 2. But until then, enjoy the rest of your summers, and Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo is created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.